Hi, my name is Kent Schofield, and you're listening to Catholic versus Atheist.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you believe, and why you believe it.
Yeah, so my name is Kent. As stated, I'm 29 years old. I live in California, a few hours north of LA. So I'm actually in one of the more liberal states, but I live in the most conservative area, probably on the entire western side of the states. I was raised in a strict Southern Baptist environment. The whole young earth creationism, once saved, always saved mentality. I would say evangelical Christian. I did a bit of door to door myself, and I never really questioned. I had questions about some of the details. I don't know if I ever got satisfying answers to all of them, but sometimes I guess I decided to let faith be the beacon and just move by those things until there was an interesting occurrence when I was in 2021, somewhere in that area. My younger brother, who was also very involved in the same religious community as me, came out as an atheist. And that confused me beyond all comprehension. I didn't even know what to make of it. At the time, I thought he's just going through a hard time. He doesn't mean that. There's no way he could possibly mean that. And I just kind of let it go and decided to let him have his own way and love him and support him, whatever he chose. And then a few years later, I came across the show that a lot of people are familiar with called Ancient Aliens. And after watching a good handful of episodes, I became quite firmly convinced that this whole scenario was true. I was convinced that, we were products of alien manipulation, that they had their hands in our history and all these great events in history. They had helped us advance technologically. If you've seen the show, I bought into it hook, line, and sinker. And it wasn't until I realized that there was a bit of a conflict between that and my religious beliefs that I saw some sort of problem. And with my simplistic kind of which one sounds more convincing kind of approach, I wasn't able to figure out which one was more likely true. And that's when I discovered skepticism. And now I don't hold either of those positions anymore.
So I'd like you to take us back to your childhood, the earliest memories about religion and God. Can you just paint a picture of what sort of impression that made on you as a very, very young child?
Absolutely. Like I said, I was raised very involved in it. So it was, we had religious activities at home. We read the Bible. I lived with my grandparents from about the age of 7 to 14. And we had nightly Bible readings. Our religious holidays were very religious. We kept the religious aspects in them, not always the more common cultural figures and whatnot. I mean, we did have Santa, but we also knew that was just for fun and that it was more about Jesus. That's how we put it out there. Attended church every chance we got. I was involved in choir and church plays and shows and stuff as early as I could remember. And I believed it all deep down to my core, and I put my best into everything I did because I thought I was doing it for God's glory. And that was what drove me. From an early age, I would say I was an outcast because I refused to do what others did because it didn't glorify God. At least I tried to. There were times I failed, but I was always repentant and always felt the shame and the guilt and needed to refocus my path.
I often ask my guests about rebellion, puberty, sex, drugs, rock and roll. Can you just paint a little picture without embarrassing yourself?
Yeah, not at all. I was abstinent probably far longer than probably most of my peers. I didn't have sex until I was 17. And I did end up marrying that person that I had sex with because I felt an obligation. I had made the promise of abstinence until marriage, and I didn't keep that promise. So I decided to go ahead and follow through and marry that person at least. So I never really did any drugs. I didn't drink in high school. The first time I did anything like that was after I was 21, and never done anything too crazy. I have smoked some marijuana and stuff like that. I've had some beer, nothing crazy.
Can you just talk about the sort of the highlights pertaining to the faith journey of your parents, how they reacted to your coming out and your brothers coming out, and any other siblings you have, sort of like which ones lost the faith, which ones came back to the faith, your ex-wife and your current wife, what was their faith journey? Just in really, really quick and brief overview. Anything interesting there?
Sure. One of the interesting things was when I came out, there was a lot of neutral response. Almost, I guess I could say, go ahead and say positive. Mostly people saying, hey, we're upset about this choice that you've made, but we love you and support you anyway. And we're always here for you. And that was great. So yeah, I'd call that a positive response. My ex-wife, we had a child together as well. And some issues arose in that when I began to explain things like the age of the earth and universe, how we came to be through evolution, trying to kind of give him a simple understanding of what evolution is and how it helped to shape us. And she found out about it and flipped her lid. She was upset that I was teaching him about evolution. I would say that's probably been the biggest point of friction. And then I am prone to sometimes post things that bring some religious ideas into question on my personal Facebook, and I don't think my family has responded well to that. And understandably, yeah, I mean, if you love your religion and you hold it near and dear to yourself, it might be hard to see criticisms against it all that often, especially from someone you love. So I've tried to kind of slow down on that because I don't want to hurt anybody. I just like the exchange of ideas and chipping away at the theistic foundation that lay underneath my whole worldview. The way that we have things structured is there's your basic beliefs that you never think about. They're just there, and they structure the way that you see the world. I call it a perspective. So it's the perspective that you see other things through. And even though I had stopped believing in God, I noticed I was still looking at things through somewhat of a theistic perspective. That being things like free will, just kind of taking for granted a moral sense, things like that. And so I've been starting to hit those key topics and try to understand them from my new perspective.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. I always encourage atheists to do that, to not settle and be mediocre in their atheism, because mediocrity won't get you to heaven. If you're a mediocre Christian, it won't get you to heaven. And if you're a mediocre atheist, it won't get you to heaven. But if you're a hardcore atheist, I think that's one of the fastest shortcuts to God, because when you dig and when you probe and when you question and examine the underlying assumptions of your atheistic worldview or of whatever your worldview is, you will be confronted. Ultimately, if you seek, you will find, and you will be confronted with reality. That's my hope for all of humanity, is to abandon the complacent mediocrity and really, really go for it. Whatever you're into, take it seriously. Don't be self-satisfied and complacent about it. So I encourage you to do that. And so were there any key issues that you wanted to talk about? Like free will is one of my favorite topics.
Okay. So what is your view on free will? How does it play into our sort of perspective of reality?
Well, it's absolutely necessary for morality that we are able to choose among the different options, right?
Do you think you could make choices without free will?
Yeah, much of our will is determined by circumstance, and a lot of atheists like to bring up the sort of physiological studies that show that we think that we made a free decision, but really we're just rationalizing after the fact. There's a lot of that. There's a lot of that. Even if I wasn't aware of the psychological and the physiological studies, I would still know, because my church teaches me, that there are a lot of areas in life where we are determined. Our will is still a will. It still chooses, just like a dog or a cat or a monkey can choose, but it's more instinct, and the will is not free in those instances. And even the free choices we make do have constraints on them. I don't want to give the impression to anyone that we have a completely free choice ever. There will always be conditions and these sorts of things that are constraining to a certain extent our will. But those times when our will is not 100% hard determined, those areas, even if they're very rare, they are what I call free. So free is a negative term. It means not 100% determined. It might be 90% determined with 10% wiggle room in that one decision, and that 10% is what is free.
Okay. I would say the very essence of our character is determined by factors almost entirely outside of our control.
Well, it's all very elusive, okay? Because even my church teaches me that even when it comes to morality, there are times where we think that we have sinned, but God knows our heart and God knows the mitigating sort of circumstances that render us less culpable or not culpable at all. So my church teaches me that even when I think I'm sinning, a lot of the time I'm not able to not sin in that particular circumstance, and God knows that, and God will judge me accordingly. So my church is telling me that there's more going on than what we're aware of. But my church also teaches me that we are responsible, that we do have free will, and that we do make choices that matter, and that we can and we do sin. So the fundamental option, obviously, is for or against God. So in everything that I'm doing and saying and thinking, and everything that I'm choosing not to do, the sins of omission, for example, I have to be aware to put God first. This is the first commandment. You know, there really is only one commandment. We say there are 10 commandments, but there's really one commandment, which is love, the love of God. And then we can subdivide that into the love of God and the love of neighbor, and we can further subdivide down into 6 and then into 10 and so on and so forth. But the basic idea is that we were created by an all-good God. We have to love him, and we do have opportunities because of our free will. How extensive that free will is, we don't know, but we do have an opportunity to say yes to God or to say no to God, and we need to be careful and to put that as priority number one.
Okay, what is your concept of hell?
Concept is separation from God. It's just falling away from the one reality, that one reality, which is the fire of hell, which is the fire of purgatory, and which is also the fire of heaven. There's only that one reality. It's the fire of God's love. If we're oriented toward that, then it's pleasurable, that fire. But if we're oriented away from it, then God help us, because it's unpleasant, to put it mildly.
Okay. So, of me being an atheist, I'm not necessarily doomed to the more tormenting aspect of that.
Well, I mean, I would not be talking to you in this calm and friendly way if I thought that you were absolutely guaranteed to go to hell. I would be a nervous wreck. If I could look into your soul and look into the future and know that you are doomed to hell, I would be physically incapacitated. I would need to lie down from the trauma of that, because I don't want anyone to deal with that, and much less someone that I'm actually speaking to and interacting with. You understand? I'm a sensitive person. I cannot bear the thought of anyone going to hell. And so to be talking to you, to actually entertain the idea that you are guaranteed to go to hell, that's just inconceivable. And my church teaches me that we cannot know that, and that we never judge that someone is lost in that way. The church never says that so-and-so is in hell. There is a tradition in the church that Judas is in hell, but I mean, that's pretty much it in all the history books. You don't get the church condemning Hitler or Mao Zedong or, you know, anyone else.
Okay. So that's a great example. We can jump on that. So Judas.
Yeah.
So if we go with the case of Judas, prior to the betrayal, Jesus says beforehand, one of you amongst me will betray me. And this is necessary for the plan of Jesus being arrested and tried and crucified for our sins. So it's all part of the plan. So if there's free will, at which point along this path did Judas will himself to become this step in God's plan? If it was part of God's plan and things go according to God's plan, then at which point was it Judas's will to become part of that plan? Was he forced to be part of it?
No. There are aspects of each of our lives that are forced, because they are, like we said, we established that there are things that are hard determined, right? So I think it's really important that we emphasize that distinction between God's positive will and his permissive will. So everything that happens is the will of God, but he doesn't ordain everything that happens. He only ordains with his positive will, but he allows evil. That's his permissive will. So every evil that takes place, every evil, is allowed by God by his permissive will, but he wills it. He does will it permissively because he can bring a higher good out of it. Now, just because he allowed the evil of the betrayal of Judas, for example, and the evil of that man that he called Satan, St. Peter, to deny him 3 times, right? We have to remember that Judas and Peter betrayed our Lord. Now, we have St. Peter being canonized as a saint, so we know that he's in heaven, and we do not have Judas canonized, and there's a tradition in the church that he is probably in hell, although the church refuses to say that definitively. So obviously there's a difference, but there's no necessary connection between being a traitor, being a sinner, and then necessarily being condemned to hell. There is always that chance of repentance, and I like to think that there is that chance of repentance even for Judas.
Even after death?
No.
Within the ending
within this
period
life
of his life?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's say, for instance, by the deterministic laws of nature, I've become the type of person who's quick to anger. And because of that, maybe I'm the type of person that lashes out, and maybe sometimes I get violent. And eventually through that violence, I do something bad. While I did make those choices, it was my choice to strike that person. It was my choice to cross the line and take it farther than it should have gone and cause harm to somebody. That's a choice. And I believe a person should be morally culpable for that. I still don't see any justification for calling that free.
I think it's important that we shift emphasis here from trying to explain free will, which is inexplicable by definition, it's a mystery, right? To what would it mean if there is only 100% hard determination of every event that happens in this natural world? What would that mean? All of the meaning of life is suddenly gone, right?
Nothing that was here before is now gone just because we've realized that it's deterministic. Now, if you're already subconsciously favoring theism, then determinism is hopeless and heartless and cold and scary and all without meaning and all without purpose. But if you look at it from within itself, you realize that the reality we've all been living in all along is deterministic. And we've realized that there isn't some, or at least we've realized that we don't have to conclude that there's some sort of wizard behind the curtain, pulling the strings. We don't lose love. We don't lose empathy. We don't lose morality or justice or hope or meaning or purpose. They just shift in a different perspective.
Yeah. You and I both inhabit one and the same reality. It's the same ultimate reality. The question is it a Catholic reality, or is it the reality of the atheist, the naturalist, the hard determinist, right? There are other options too, but I just want to limit it to our two perspectives here. So I can tell you honestly that I don't know with 100% certainty that we live in a Catholic universe. I'm 99.99 repeated percent sure that we are, but I have to admit, because I'm a fallible human being, that I might be wrong. Just like you will probably admit that you are probably about the same amount certain about your worldview, but there is that negligible but non-zero doubt that you have about you being right? So whatever ultimate reality is, might be Catholic, it might be atheist, it might be whatever. Whatever it is, that's what we are living in, right? So we have in our possession all of these experiences, all these wonderful things that make us human, right? I think that's what you're saying, and I think I agree with you 100%.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly what I say, because as an atheist, one of the most frustrating things is encountering those of a more theistic mindset who feel the need to throw lines out there like, oh, you're an atheist, you don't believe in God, then how could you have love? Because God is love. And I say, well, you're just defining God as love. I'm seeing love as a certain relationship between my emotional state and the external reality, or even internal reality that helps to bring that internal state into being. That's what love is to me. It doesn't have some sort of, and I know this is big in the theological brains throughout history, talking about the grounding in this and the grounding in that, whether it's morality or truth or justice or love. They all point to God for that. I don't believe that any such thing exists. I don't see why it needs a grounding to begin with. Just choose what goal you're going towards, what outcome you'd like to achieve, and that's your grounding itself. It's the grounding that you've chosen for that particular pursuit or experience or whatever you want to call it. I like talking about morality, and it's my perspective, it's my view that I think people make it a lot more difficult than it needs to be. I feel like people dance around the obvious truth because it doesn't match what they're used to hearing when it comes to morality. And I credit Sam Harris for opening my eyes to this. I know a lot of people, even atheists, I know a lot of atheists don't buy into his landscape of morality. I do. I find it extremely convincing, and a scientific basis for morality is simply the real physical effects that actions and behaviors have on conscious beings. Does it help or hinder? Does it promote well-being, or does it promote suffering? And by that standard, it's moral or immoral. And I think it's quite simple, because by definition, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about morality.
Yeah. My counter argument against this sort of morality is that it's a might makes right form of morality, where you just, society at large is carrying this big stick with which they curb those whom they deem arbitrarily to be aberrant or out of line with the established consensus on what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. That's a hellish nightmare for me, because I'm a little bit eccentric and different. So I don't want a society that's going to curb my behavior based on this consensus rule of might makes right. Do you understand my predicament there?
No, I definitely do. And I think that's one thing that can be overcome by just getting a little bit further into the topic, which is simply, this isn't about anybody's opinion. This isn't even about a society's opinion. The truth is, if I come over and lop off one of your body parts, that is not, unless that body part staying attached to your body is going to cause you harm, me lopping that healthy and legitimate body part off of you for without your consent is immoral, because it does not promote your well-being. And in fact, it promotes much suffering. And unnecessary suffering at that. There was no reason for it to happen. If I felt the need to do that, if it made me happy, it still caused suffering, and my well-being was not promoted in any way by it. My happiness may have been, but that has nothing to do with well-being. Of course, being happy helps your well-being, but I can go on and do other things that don't cause suffering that can make me happy. And if you're incapable of finding your well-being without causing suffering to others, then there's obviously something wrong with you. And that can be shown, again, through nothing more than the scientific facts about psychology and your physiology of your brain. There's no judgment call here that's outside of the purview of pure objective facts.
Is the standard by which you are judging morality, is that standard of goodness absolute, objective, eternal, and unchanging, or not? If it is, then welcome to monotheism. You are worshiping my God. And if it's not, then who cares about anything that you have to say?
Of the criteria that you just gave, one hits, and that would be objective. It's not absolute, because chopping off somebody's hand generally is immoral. But there are instances where it is the best move to make. And that would be determined by the objective facts. Let's say somebody was bitten by a venomous snake and their hand is beginning to decay and pus, and it's going to spread up their arm. So you chop that hand off, you save their life. Today, in a third world country, that may be the best thing to do. 200 years from now, when medical science advances to the point that that hand can practically decay away and they can just fix it with whatever new medical advances they have, chopping that hand off is no longer the best thing to do. And so it's neither eternal nor absolute, but it is still, it's based on the objective facts right now. Now, the conditions surrounding any given moral choice may change over time. And that's why not only do I not believe in an absolute morality, but I don't see why anybody would want one, because what is moral in one situation is not moral in every situation, and so it can't be absolute.
Everything that you've said is completely in conformity with the Catholic teaching on morality. Of course, there are shifting circumstances, and the context is very important, and it depends on what we know and what technology we have and all these sorts of things. Of course, I agree with everything you said. Everything you said is Catholic. And the whole point of Christian morality is that it's not easy to apply the Ten Commandments to tricky situations in the messy real world. It's not easy. If it were easy, it wouldn't be a moral choice that you made. It would just be an obvious choice where you apply Rule 13b because that's the circumstance and you looked it up in the book and there's your answer, right? It's not a moral choice unless we have to struggle to apply the Ten Commandments and to apply love and to apply wisdom and to apply the virtues. And I wanted to ask you about virtue. What is virtue for you? Because if you read the ancient Greek philosophers, for example, you'll see a lot of emphasis on the virtues. Is there a place for virtue ethics in Sam Harris and in your worldview?
I believe, yeah, absolutely. So to me, when I think of virtue, what comes to mind is doing the thing that's more difficult to do because you realize that it would be the most appropriate thing to do. So when somebody says patience is a virtue, for instance, it's hard to wait, but you know that waiting for that outcome in the future is the right thing to do because it's actually going to get you towards your intended goal much better than losing patience and taking shortcuts and cheating yourself out of a better result in that sense. And we're at a point now where we're agreeing essentially on how morality functions. It's not absolute in the sense that, like you said, rule A, 1A-14, it says this and we must do this. That, to me, that's what I mean by absolute, is a set dictate, like it is morally wrong to kill. Not true. There are instances where it's morally wrong not to kill. So not absolute, not eternal, because it changes by context. So the only thing that remains is objective. Because if you go to Saudi Arabia, just by virtue of being an atheist, they can kill me for that because it's so immoral to them. Whereas over here in America, and I believe in Canada as well, we're free to be of any religious affiliation that we choose to be. So in that sense, that's not objective, but that's the problem. If we could reason with the people of Saudi Arabia and get them to see the objective fact that being atheist does no harm, and that they're doing more harm by having these legal mandates in place, then we could come to a moral agreement on nothing but objective facts. One great example that Sam Harris gives is he says people that like to say that he's cheating by saying what is moral is that which maximizes well-being while minimizing suffering. He says you take something that has gray areas. Like, nobody would argue that there's a difference between food and poison. There is food, that which you eat, which brings nourishment to your body and doesn't bring harm to your body. And there are things that are poisonous, things that do only harm to your body and bring no nourishment, or are outweighed by whatever nourishment they bring based on the amount of suffering that they bring. And the fact that there are gray areas, that there are people allergic to peanuts that will die if they eat tuna, or will not be able to have a properly functioning digestive system if they drink a cup of milk. The fact that there are gray areas, and even foods that all of us may be able to eat, but it may do some damage to us, doesn't mean that there's no difference between food and poison. And in that same sense, when it comes to morality, we do have these gray areas. We have things like we can't agree with Saudi Arabia on how people should be able to practice their free religious preferences. Doesn't mean that there isn't a right and wrong answer. Essentially, this is how I put it, is morality is a man-made construct. When there are no conscious minds to weigh the benefits and the drawbacks of any given action, then there is no morality. It just simply doesn't exist. A lion needs to eat, so he eats the gazelle. The gazelle wants to live, so it tries to escape the lion. There is no morality involved there. All of those acts are amoral. When I'm hungry and I see an old lady walking down a back alley to get to her apartment with an armful of groceries, if I go and strike her dead and steal her groceries because I'm hungry, that is an immoral act because there is conscious suffering involved. Even though I might try to be able to justify the taking of her life to support myself, my family, perhaps, I might need to feed us. Doing harm to that woman brings unnecessary suffering into the world. We were already suffering. We were already hungry. Taking from her creates more problems than it solves. And therefore, it is immoral.
Yeah, one of the things I like to bring up with atheists about morality is that if there is no difference in outcome, then there is no philosophical basis for morality. You and I are both headed for complete and total annihilation according to your worldview, whereas in my worldview, hopefully we'll both end up in heaven, but both of us may end up in hell, or one in heaven, one in hell. How do you respond to that devastating argument?
I say, again, you have to be looking through a theistic perspective to begin with in order for that to have any weight at all. If you're just looking at it from a neutral or naturalistic perspective, what could matter more than the effects that take place during any given lifetime or during the totality of human lifetime? if I strike an old lady dead, what have I done? Well, I've taken somebody's life. Well, say there's nobody left in her family. She was the last one. Who have I hurt? Maybe nobody except for her. But still, what I've done is I've taken part in an activity that, if allowed in a society, would bring havoc and could throw the whole of human civilization into disarray. Obviously, I'm not going to be allowed to do that. If they want to find the person who did that and hold me accountable, that's something that has to happen for society to exist. So I have to be held accountable, whether or not there's a heaven or hell that she's living in afterlife, or that I will be held accountable for that in the afterlife. The accountability is here and now. And so a great example I always hear is Hitler. Hitler had all those millions of people killed and then just killed himself. So on an atheistic worldview, he got away with it. Well, no, he didn't, because he died. I mean, sure, it would have been great to maybe draw out his punishment a bit more, but he didn't get away with it. He died.
If it doesn't matter what you do, if you're guaranteed to have the same outcome no matter what you do, then we can cater to our lower instincts. And when I don't play a lot of video games, I don't like them, but when I find a video game that I like, there are different sorts of games. In some games, you have to be careful that you don't die. In other games, it doesn't matter how many times you die, you just try that puzzle again and try a different thing. And there are many different game mechanics in video games that make a real difference on how you approach the puzzle that's before you, or the challenge that's before you in that particular scene of that particular level of that particular game. It does make a difference. If there is no God and there's no heaven, there's no hell, you can literally do whatever you want and you can try to maximize your pleasure. And as long as you don't get caught, then you're winning. You don't have to suffer through doing the good thing to just do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. That's a pain. It's a pain to do the right thing. Just like it's a pain for me to cook a healthy meal. I'd rather just grab a bag of chips and a bag of cookies or whatever.
Well, no, okay, so I see where you're going, and no, it's a great point you raise, and it does require serious attention. And again, I got to keep, this is one of my biggest points when I talk to people, is it all comes back to the perspective with which you're looking at it. So let's just say today, after talking with me, I know I'm not going to have this effect on you, so this is completely hypothetical. You decide you've become convinced that there is no God. We've been living in a natural universe this whole time. You realize that every effort you've made to be a more compassionate human being that has brought you joy, that has helped others around you, and the fact that you were able to connect with them through the empathy that is allowed by the biological structure of your brain, your mind, which is a product of the brain, all of that is still there. If that isn't motivation enough for you to do the right thing, then there's something psychologically wrong with you, because that's the way our brains are programmed. Our brains are programmed to be generally empathetic. Now, in an ultimate sense, if I kill somebody and get away with it, it sucks that can happen. But having a crappy outcome doesn't mean that we just decide that reality isn't the case. It seems to me, I call this an argument from emotion, an appeal to emotions fallacy, because whether or not we get away with it ultimately doesn't mean that we have to imagine that there is something that grounds it to eternity, that person who killed somebody and nobody ever found out, they got theirs in the end. Of course, we want to try to discourage those kinds of people from feeling as though they have the freedom to do that. But those people, I guarantee you, each and every one of them has something psychologically, physiologically wrong with their brain. And if they got the help that they needed, or if they were secluded from society, then that problem would cease to exist. While as a whole, the human society runs on empathy and love and compassion.
Yeah. Yeah, it is beyond obvious that even though it's a longer, more painful route to happiness, it's a more secure route. It's the right thing to do. And people try to have, for the most part, balanced and healthy lives. So we can agree about that. But the question really is about justice. I have a worldview that tells me that justice is achieved, finally. You live according to a worldview that says that justice is not achieved on balance in the big picture. If you look at the big picture, people are striving for justice And sometimes it's partially achieved. Sometimes it may seem like there's a victory where justice was completely achieved in a small context, in a particular way, in a place and time. But we know that if justice is a perfectly white piece of paper and injustice is a black mark on that paper, we know that there's at least a certain percentage of that white sheet of paper that's covered permanently in black marks of injustice, right?
Sure. And it's one of those lessons that your parents teach you from an early age, is that, you know what, sometimes life isn't fair. And if the world on a whole is not completely just, then that's just an objective fact. And if we're trying to strive towards a more just world, how else could we get there besides focusing on objective facts and trying to achieve justice through that? I don't believe perfect justice can ever truly exist. That may be an ideal that comes to you from your theism, but I don't see it being a reality that we can demonstrate and use to argue for theism. It's something that comes out of it, not something that can be used to get to it.
Did your beeper signify anything there for you?
Oh, that was my wife coming home.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, it seems my daughter will probably wake up here in just a minute as well, too. So.
Okay. So there's a lot more I want to talk to you about. Maybe we'll do part 2 sometime in the future, but
that'd be great.
You know how at the end of my episodes I like to have the guest wrap up and give a little final closing thought. Something nice. What could you say to anyone that might be out there listening now?
I say no matter what you believe, no matter what side of the fence that you fall on, the truth is that we all live in this world together. We all live out our lives in connection with other people that believe differently than us. And I think the best thing we can do is to try to share and compare ideas, but in the meantime, try to be respectful, because nobody's going to listen to you if all you do is disrespect them and treat them horribly. So whether you're an atheist trying to talk to theists or the other way around, don't presume to know better than them in every instance, and don't treat them like garbage just because they think differently than you.
If you like your worldview, if you think it's swell, if you got some questions, ask me and I'll tell. All you got to do is ask. All you got to do is